Today we'll discuss about skeletal muscle contraction. About the skeletal muscle description I have already given in the last class. So we'll move on to the contraction of the skeletal muscle. So when you take the contraction of the skeletal muscle, two things are very, very important. One is dendrite, another one is the axon. So if you take dendrite, so the dendrite is the thing like which always receives the information, and axon will transmit the information. So in addition to the transmission of the information, so they will be having a vesicles containing neurotransmitters. So these neurotransmitters, they will stimulate or inhibit the muscle contraction. So the junction between these two is known as a neuromuscular junction. So this neuromuscular junction, there will be a exchange of the neurotransmitters and there will be a transmission of the neurotransmitter. So now if you take the neuromuscular junction, so it will look something like this. Neuromuscular junction looks something like this. So if you take this axon terminal, so there is a transmission of the nerve impulses in the axon terminal. So in the axon, you can see there are organelles are present like mitochondria, and you have the vesicle. So inside the vesicle, there are the acetylcholine, which are known as a neurotransmitter. So whenever there is a transmission of the nerve impulses, so these vesicles, they move towards the end of the wall and they release the content, that is the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and then that will lead to the repolarization of the membrane. So this is how the nerve transmission occur, and this occurs in the neuromuscular junction. So if you move on to the next one, so if you take the electron microscopic view of a neuromuscular junction, so it looks something like this. You can see axon terminal and then the synaptic ends. You can also find the blood capillaries here, somatic motor neuron. So this is electron microscopic view of the neuromuscular junction. So now one more thing is the synapse. So what is this synapse? So it is a junction between the axonal end of one neuron and the dendrite end of the another neuron, or it can be simply called as a membrane of the another cell type. So synapse will lead to the synaptic cleft, that is the separation that exists between the axon ending of the motor neuron and sarcolemma of the muscle cell fiber. So that is known as the synaptic cleft. Okay, so the axon ending, usually it will be containing the neurotransmitter in the vesicles. So if you take neurotransmitters, so they are nothing but they are the chemical substances so which are present in the vesicle-like structure. For example, acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter released by the motor neurons. So when stimulated by the nerve impulses, so what happens to this acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter, it will be released. It travels across the synaptic cleft and binds the receptor on the motor end plate. So that leads to the contraction of the muscle or the skeletal muscle. So if you take that contraction, usually it is called as a sliding filament theory or the sliding filament contraction or the movement. So here the sarcomere plays a very important role. So sarcomere, already we have discussed what is sarcomere. So sarcomere is the functional unit of the skeletal muscle. So when a skeletal muscle contracts, the sarcomere always, it shortens. So this is described by a theory known as a sliding filament theory, or it is also called as a sliding filament contraction. So if you take a sliding filament theory, so in sliding filament theory, always what happens is the sarcomere shortens because it is made up of two things. One is the thick and the thin filament, so which will slide and pass on one another. So that's why the shortening of the sarcomere appears. So the thin filament move towards the center of the sarcomere from both the ends. So now you can see there is a myosin binding site on the actin. So this is your myosin and this is your actin. So they slide on each other. So when they are sliding on each other, what happens? The sarcomere shortens. So if you take the So if you see the again the electron microscopic view of the this sliding mechanism, you can see like this. So it will look something like this. So you can see in the sarcomere, I said you, like the bands, like you have a H zone, I band, and the A band will be visible like this. So this is in the relaxed muscles you are seeing. So when there is a partial contraction, you can see, you can make out the difference here. And when there is a contraction happening, so you can see it is getting shrinked. When you compare the first one with the last one, you can see the sarcomere is shrinked there. So this is what will happen in the case of a sliding filament movement. So when this skeletal muscle contraction is happening, that is due to the transmission of the nerve impulses, that leads to the release of a neurotransmitter. So what and all the physiological things happen when there is a release of a neurotransmitter? Motor impulse is initiated in the brain, travels through the brain and the spinal cord to a motor nerve ending. Motor nerve ending, that is the axon, it gets depolarized. Calcium enters the axon endings, and then calcium, what it will do is it will release the acetylcholine, that is the neurotransmitter present in the muscle, to the synaptic cleft. So these are all the physiological things which happens when there is a transmission of the nerve impulses and release of the neurotransmitter. So now if you take here, so you can see there is a presynaptic neuron. So you can see the axon, and then in the axon, what is happening? There is a transmission of the direction of the nerve impulses, transmission of the nerve impulses. So in the transmission of the nerve impulses, what is happening in the vesicle? There are neurotransmitters. So those neurotransmitters are coming towards the end of this axon terminal, and there is a release. So when there is a release of this one, you can see there is a formation of a knob-like structure. So this is known as the synaptic knob. So once it is released, so this will undergo the changes. So this is the synapse, that is the gap between these two. It is known as the synapse. So it will undergo the modification. So the upper portion is called as a presynaptic neuron, and the lower portion, it is called as a postsynaptic neuron. So when this portion, it is extended and it is shown here, you can see what is happening. You can see here. So there is a, like, calcium ions are entering. You can see the mitochondria, the organelle present there, the vesicle with the neurotransmitters. So it is going and binding, and there is a release of the neurotransmitter. So when there is a release of neurotransmitters in the synaptic cliff, what is happening? So there is a change in the ions on the both the sides of the membrane. So the polarized membrane will become a depolarized membrane, and this is all happening because of a direction of the nerve impulses or transmission of the nerve impulses. So now if you take the physiology behind the depolarization. So what happens is the acetylcholine binds the receptor on the motor end plate. It will undergo the depolarization. So then what will happen? The impulses it will be traveling through the tubules and reaches the muscle fiber. So there you can see muscle depolarization courses releases the calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the sarcoplasm. And this action, that is the release of the calcium, in turn will lead to the release of the neurotransmitter that is present in the vesicle. So now if you take this sliding filament mechanism, so it will look something like this. You can see the actin filament, and then you can see the myosin filament. So we